Forgot my scarf, and it's very cold here in Russia. I am standing in front of a painting of one of the Russian rulers we're going to be learning about today. This is Ivan the Terrible, and as I tell you some more of the background and details about him, I want you to see if you can figure out what's going on in this scene, in this painting. I'm of course wearing my Russian hat for a very cold Russian winter. It's pretty cool because I can take down the ear flaps and make an awesome, like, really warm and cozy and protective hat as well. Genius. All right, so let's get going. If you want to get your Cornell Notes page out and a pencil, as soon as you're ready, let's get started. Okay. We're going to back up a little bit since we've been focusing on Western Europe, and we're going to head back to Russia, more in the medieval time period, moving into the Renaissance. So in the early days of Russia, the land of Rus wasn't one country with one ruler. Instead, warrior princes ruled over different Russian tribes. The prince who finally brought the Russian cities together was named Ivan. He was a descendant of Rurik, the Viking invader who first settled Russia. Interesting. Because he made Russia into one country, he is remembered as Ivan the Great. Ivan the Great was the prince of the Russian city of Moscow. When Ivan began to rule in Moscow in the year 1462, his first task was to get Moscow free from the local Mongol kingdom. Remember, after Kublai Khan died, the enormous Mongol Empire broke up into smaller kingdoms ruled by the warlords called Khans. And one of these Mongol kingdoms claimed part of the land of Russia. The local Khan demanded that Ivan pay him tribute, money to show that Ivan recognized the Mongols as the true rulers of the Russian land. Ivan refused to pay tribute, and so the Mongol Khan sent a message saying, "You pay up or I'll attack you." Ivan simply retorted, "Go ahead, make my day," maybe in the vernacular of the time. So the Khan assembled his army and marched up to Moscow's walls. Ivan the Great gathered his soldiers and got ready to fight back. Then the Khan turned his men around and marched home. His army wasn't really strong enough to defeat Ivan's Russians. He had been bluffing, hoping that Ivan would pay tribute because he was scared of the Mongols' reputation and he wanted to avoid a fight. But the truth was that Ivan was more powerful than the Mongols, and now Moscow was free from Mongol rule. Ivan's next job was to conquer other Russian cities and make them loyal to him. He captured Kiev and took their princes off their thrones and replaced them with governors who would be loyal to him. He made Moscow the capital city of this new and unified Russia. An ancient fortress called the Kremlin lay at the center of Moscow, and Ivan the Great built strong walls around the Kremlin and hired a famous architect to build beautiful cathedrals inside it. And you know about that, okay, a little bit. Ivan the Great was a good Russian king, okay? But his grandson, Ivan the Terrible, became legendary for his wickedness. Okay, so let's leave Ivan the Great having unified Russia, defeated the Mongol Khan who was controlling it, and go now to his grandson. Why was he named Ivan the Terrible? By the time Ivan the Terrible became king, the most important city, the people in Moscow liked to call their city the Third Rome. Okay, so there was Rome itself, then there was Constantinople, and they thought Moscow was the third Rome, the third most powerful city in the world. So the ruler of this third Rome was a powerful man indeed. Okay. Ivan the Terrible took his power very seriously. He called himself Tsar, which means Caesar, to show that he was as powerful as the ancient Roman emperors used to be. And at first he used his power to make Russia stronger. But then his beloved wife died, and after her death, Ivan began to go mad. His hair and his beard began to fall out. He accused his advisors of treachery and ordered them executed. And he formed a special secret band of police who were supposed to look out for anyone who might be plotting against the Tsar. These secret police rode black horses with black saddles and bridles. Each carried a flag with a picture of a broom and a dog's head on it, to show that they were pledged to sniff out evildoers and sweep them away. Does this remind you, students, of anything that we've been reading in Breaking Stalin's Nose? This occurred like 400 years earlier, and yet these same kind of themes and language, the same imagery is repeating itself from history, right? Ivan the Terrible. The secret police turned out to be the worst evildoers of all. They killed innocent people, took land and houses from anyone they pleased, stole from stores, and burned down the homes of anyone who tried to impose them. And Ivan himself sometimes joined in their crimes. If the secret police told him that a village contained traitors, Ivan would order the entire village executed. And when the Eastern Orthodox Archbishop scolded Ivan for his cruelty, Ivan had his cathedral looted, stripped off the archbishop's clothes, and sent him away in the snow. The noblemen of Russia became tired of Ivan's antics and his antics with the secret police, and they wanted his son, who was now a grown man, to become the Tsar in his father's place. But Ivan the Terrible refused to give up his throne. One day, he and his son began to argue over the future of Russia. Ivan grew so angry that he struck out at his son with his staff. It was a heavy oak stick, and it was tipped on the end with iron. The blow landed on his son's head and killed him instantly. When Ivan realized what he had done, he tried to throw himself from the tallest tower in the Kremlin. But his servants held him back, and for the rest of his life, Ivan the Terrible dressed in black. He paced the halls of his palace at night, weeping and groaning. And when he saw comet in the evening sky, he announced, "My death is near." Shortly afterwards, he collapsed and died, and Rurik's dynasty was at an end. Okay? Fascinating figures, Ivan the Great and Ivan the Terrible, beginning this history of the secret police that continued into communist Russia. Instead of black horses, they had black cars. Okay, Ivan the Terrible, crazy, killed his own son and then wanted to throw himself off the Kremlin. For 100 years, basically, Russia is back into just these tribal units and just chaos because Ivan had left no heir. He'd killed his son, and when he himself died, there was no one else to take over. It wasn't until 100 years later that Peter I, who became known as Peter the Great, became Tsar of Russia. So let's learn a little bit more about him as we finish off. Okay, so change your notes a little bit. We've got Ivan the Great, Ivan the Terrible, and now our third topic is Peter the Great. Okay. Peter I became Tsar of Russia in 1682. Make sure you get that date down, 1682. 1 year after William Penn founded a colony in Pennsylvania. So we've got exploration by the English going on in America. So you can think about Queen Elizabeth at this time. And then we've got this Russian history happening in 1682. So we're jumping ahead just a little bit. Actually, quite a bit, aren't we? When was Queen Elizabeth crowned? And William Shakespeare in the 1590s. So this is about 90 years later. The young Tsar was only 10, so he became the Tsar at 10 years old, and his older sister Sophia took control of the royal palace in Moscow and ruled as his regent. Peter was sent to the country, where he spent hours climbing trees, roaming through the fields, and playing war games. He divided his friends into regiments and gave them uniforms, flags, and drums. When Peter was 11, he was allowed to use real cannons in his war games. How about growing up as a Tsar, right? Meanwhile, Sophia ordered Russian troops into battle, had herself painted wearing the crown of the Tsars, and behaved more and more as though she were the real Tsar of Russia. When Peter was 17, Sophia tried to convince her royal guard to attack Peter and his mother in their country home, but the royal guard refused. They had grown tired of Sophia and her tyranny. Instead, the royal guard swore allegiance to Peter, the rightful Tsar of Russia. Sophia, frightened of her brother, fled to a convent where she became a nun and spent the rest of her life. Now Peter was truly the Tsar of Russia. He is 17 at this point. Peter had always been fascinated by the West, but not very many Europeans traveled to Russia, and those who settled in Russia lived apart from the Russians in special colonies for foreigners. Peter had spent hours in these colonies talking to the Westerners who lived there. He had even found an old rotten English sailboat in his shed, and he was fascinated by it. Peter wanted ships like the English had. He wanted to build a navy that could sail to Europe. He wanted a fleet of merchant ships that could take Russian honey, wax, and furs to Europe and bring back all the luxuries of the West for Russians to enjoy. But Peter knew that Russia would never be able to visit the West without a good port for ships to sail in and out of. Russia's northern coast was so cold and icy that ships couldn't even reach it for most of the year. And Peter's only port city, the city of Archangel, was so far north that it was frozen solid for half the year. During the cold, dark Arctic winters, the sun only rose for 5 short hours a day. And the air was so cold that if you spat on the ground, your spit would freeze before it landed. Russia needed a warmer port, and Peter had his eye on one, the port of Azov. The Sea of Azov led right into the Black Sea, which led to the Mediterranean Sea. Azov belonged to the Ottoman Turks. But Peter was sure that the Russian army could defeat the Turks in battle and claim Azov for Russia. So Peter marched his army down to Azov and laid a siege under the fortress that protected the port. He wrote out a demand for surrender, attached it to an arrow, and ordered an archer to shoot it into the city. But the Turks simply laughed at Peter's demand when they retrieved it from the arrow. Peter soon saw why. Turkish ships could sail right into Azov to bring food and weapons to the Turks inside the fortress. And meanwhile, the Russians, camped outside the walls, began to run out of food and ammunition. The weather was growing colder, and a savage winter was coming. Peter realized that he would never be able to capture Azov unless he could stop Turkish ships from resupplying it. So he withdrew his army and ordered his men to build 25 warships and hundreds of barges, all before spring. The Russian soldiers labored all winter building this huge fleet and learning how to sail it. When spring came, the brand new Russian Navy drove away the Turkish galleys that arrived to save Azov. Meanwhile, Russian soldiers began to build a pile of rubble high against Azov's walls. When the mound was high enough, Soldiers poured over it into the fortress, and the Turks waved their turbans in surrender. Azov had fallen, so Peter now had his port city. He still couldn't trade freely with the West because the Ottoman Turks also guarded the strait, or narrow place, that led out of the Sea of Azov toward the Mediterranean. And so Peter planned to drive the Turks away from this strait too, and then his path to the West would be open. But Peter needed help if he was going to keep fighting against the Turks. So he decided to visit Europe. He was able to see how Western countries ran their navies and their trading companies. And he was going to try to convince the nations of Europe to join with him in war against the Turks. He would be the first Russian Tsar to travel to the West. Peter collected an enormous group of noblemen, officials, servants, soldiers, and sailors into an expedition and set off for the West. He planned to visit Poland, then to travel through Germany, Holland, and England, and his journey took a year and a half. Peter spent months learning all about the accomplishments of Western companies. He spent about 4 months working in the English docks in England. He visited the Tower of London. He even went to a Quaker meeting. The Westerners who met the Tsar of Russia admired his curiosity and his quick brain. Okay. But they thought he was a little strange and foreign. He drank a lot. His clothes were patched and not very clean. He punched and kicked his friends if they displeased him. Even made one of his aides eat an entire tortoise just for fun. One could wish, wrote a fancy German lady who met Peter at a ball, that his manners were a little less rustic. One can see that he has had no one to teach him how to eat properly. Peter returned to Russia full of new ideas. He shaved off his beard so he would look more Western. Then he ordered his noblemen to shave their beards too. He thought that all those Russian beards made them look too old-fashioned and too Eastern. Russian noblemen hated this idea. They didn't want to look like Europeans. Many believed that their beards symbolized a special relationship with God. Some were even afraid that they wouldn't be able to get into heaven without their beards. So they kept the shaved beards in special bags, hoping to put the beards in their coffins. But Peter was adamant. He carried a pair of scissors with him everywhere. If he saw a nobleman with a beard, he would begin to cut it off. Peter also ordered his noblemen to wear Western clothes. If he saw a courtier with a long Eastern tunic, he used his scissors to hack off its bottom and its flowing sleeves. He also wanted women to take off their veils and mingle with men at social gatherings. He wanted women to have tutors and to be educated like men. But although Peter hoped to make Russians look and act more Western, he didn't want them to be Westerners. Western philosophers in countries such as France and Spain were insisting that all men and women were equal, and that rulers, even czars, shouldn't have the power to do exactly as they pleased. Peter didn't want his Russians to become that Western or develop those Western ideas. And we're going to talk about one more battle that Peter had in his desire to develop this trading route into the West, right? He's gone to Europe now. He's learned all about Western philosophy and ideas. Still got to battle against the Turks, okay? He couldn't, while he was in Europe, convince either England or Holland to join him in a war against the Turks. Peter owned the port of Azov, but he couldn't get into the Mediterranean. So Peter had 86 warships, but no place to go, basically. Peter knew that if he kept on fighting the Turks without help, he would probably lose. He studied his maps, looking for another clear path to Europe. But the only other way to send his ships to Europe would be to launch them into the Baltic Sea. And unfortunately, Sweden owned the shores of the Baltic. So Peter declared war on Sweden. Sweden's neighbors, Denmark and Norway, joined with him. Once, Denmark, Norway, and Sweden had all been ruled by one king, but Sweden had now broken away and was growing larger, stronger, and greedier. And so the people of Denmark and Norway hoped that with the help of Russia they could beat this swelling Swedish empire. Peter believed that he could beat Sweden in just a few short weeks. After all, the Swedish army was led by their 19-year-old king, Charles XII. Charles was known for his wild parties and his reckless stunts, such as making his whole court go out and hunt for bears, armed with only pitchforks. Peter didn't think that this noisy boy would be able to plan and carry out a very good military campaign, but Peter was wrong. His war with Sweden lasted for the next 21 years. It began in 1700. The war started off very badly for Peter. He started off to attack Narva, which was a Swedish city on the eastern banks of the Baltic. But his army was hauling so many cannons and siege weapons that the journey took months. Meanwhile, Charles invaded Denmark and scared the Danish into surrendering. So one of his helpers was now out of the fight. And when Peter's army finally reached Narva, the cannons wouldn't work properly. Russian gunpowder was so bad that cannonballs often staggered out of the cannons and plopped harmlessly to earth. Other times, the gunpowder overfired and blew up the entire cannon. So while the Russians struggled with their cannons, Peter decided to return to Moscow to check on how the government was working in his absence. Just hours after he rode off, the Russian army learned that a huge Swedish army under Charles's command was only 6 miles away from Narva. They scrambled frantically to prepare for battle. But just as the Swedes came into view, a huge snow squall opened right above the Russians. In the blinding, violent cloud of snow, the Russians couldn't get into line or even face the right direction. The cavalry rode the wrong direction, fell into the Narva River, and drowned. The general and his officers galloped toward the Swedes, doing their best to surrender as quickly as possible. Charles XII was delighted by this victory. He ordered a medal made celebrating the triumph. The medal showed Peter the Great running away, holding a handkerchief to his eyes, which were squirting out streams of tears. The Russian army retreated, and Charles decided not to chase them. Winter was coming, and he knew that his army might freeze to death in the icy Russian wilderness. So the Swedish troops started to wait out the long winter. Meanwhile, Peter returned to prepare his own army for spring. He ordered new cannons forged and ships repaired. He drafted more soldiers for the army, taught them how to fight with both guns and bayonets. By the time fighting began again, the Russians were strong enough to hold off the Swedes. Battle followed battle, and Peter the Great took a personal role in the war, traveling from front to front, leading attacks, sailing on warships, and even helping to repair the ships in the shipyard. In 1702, Peter finally managed to capture a small Swedish fortress on the Neva River, which led into the Baltic Sea. He still couldn't sail into the Baltic, which was guarded by the Swedish Navy, but he was sure that he would win the Baltic from the Swedes. Then ships could sail from the little Neva fortress to Europe, and the banks of the Neva River would be Russia's window to the west. So Peter planned out a brand new city on the shores of the Neva, and he named his city St. Petersburg. The land where St. Petersburg would be built was swampy and muddy, filled with water birds, reeds, and mosquitoes. There were no trees for lumber, no stones for foundations. There were no buildings except for Peter's new royal palace, which was a little hut with 3 rooms, no stove, and rickety wooden walls painted to look like brick. But Peter wasn't discouraged. In his imagination, he could already see the skyline of a great city, as great as any Western European city. As the war with Sweden dragged on, Peter ordered every soldier who could be spared to work on building St. Petersburg. He forced peasants and Swedish prisoners of war to work on it too, and paid them so little that they had to steal and beg in order to have enough to eat. Every piece of wood and every stone had to be dragged to St. Petersburg from far away, and there were no wheelbarrows, so the workers carried loads of stones in the laps of their long shirts. While Peter built, Charles XII plotted his strategy. 6 years after Peter began work on St. Petersburg, Charles invaded Russia. And the Russian army fell back. The Swedes chased them deep into Russia. but it was already fall and cold weather threatened. Charles's soldiers began to whisper about the horrors of a Russian winter. It had become so cold, they told each other, that birds would die flying through the air and hit the ground like stones. Charles, excited by the prospect of victory, told his men to go on. The Russian army kept retreating until the only shelter nearby was a tiny walled town with one small door. Then the temperatures plummeted. One of the coldest spells in memory had struck the Russian plains. The Swedes clustered toward the narrow door of the town, but it took 3 days for the whole army to file through. Meanwhile, more than 3,000 soldiers froze to death. Frostbite took the noses, ears, fingers, and toes of thousands more. The whole time, the Russians were camped safely nearby. Their heavy furs and warm boots and their winter-proof tents kept them safe. When the weakened Swedes finally met the Russians in battle, the Russians were triumphant. 10,000 Swedish soldiers were killed or captured. But Charles XII refused to surrender. The war sputtered on. 4 years later, Charles was killed by a bullet during a meaningless battle. And without Charles, the Swedes gave up. They surrendered the eastern shore of the Baltic to Peter, and now Peter's window to the west was wide open. For the next few years of his reign, Peter worked hard to make Russia as rich as any Western nation. He built canals, factories, iron mills, mines. He brought European craftsmen to Russia to teach Russians how to make cloth, lacquerware, and other goods. He worked hard on St. Petersburg, which he declared to be his new capital city. In 1714, 12 years after the city began, a Western diplomat sniffed that the city was no more than a heap of villages linked together. But only 10 years later, in 1724, the same diplomat marveled that St. Petersburg had become a wonder of the world, filled with magnificent palaces. But Peter had only short time to enjoy his beautiful city. In that same year of 1724, he was sailing to visit a Russian factory when a nearby boat ran aground on a sandbar and began to sink. Peter leapt into the icy water to pull the sailors to safety. The icy water brought on fever and illness, and Peter never recovered. He died while trying to write down the name of his successor. When Peter died, the Empire of Russia stretched from Archangel in the north down to the Caspian Sea in the south and over to the borders of Poland and Sweden on the west. Moscow and St. Petersburg had become cities filled with Western merchants and diplomats. Russian diplomats visited every European court. Peter had made Russia larger, but even more important, he had made Russia part of Europe. No wonder he became known as Peter the Great. All right, before we close, take a look at this painting again behind me. See if you can tell the difference, what's going on in this scene, and think about the difference between Ivan the Terrible and Peter the Great. Okay, we have a bunch of noblemen gathered around Ivan the Terrible. A man is kneeling in front of him, seems to be some kind of nobleman. What do you think is about to happen to him? Okay. Let me move just a little bit. I'm hiding something significant that's going on in this picture. Let's see, I gotta go this way. Okay. This is one of the noblemen that has been captured being treacherous by the secret police. He's about to be killed and executed by Ivan the Terrible. Okay. You can see he's already wearing the gray, black clothing. Maybe he's already gone insane, killed his son, and the other noblemen are kind of laughing at the traitor's fate. It looks like a jester behind the throne, doesn't it? Falling over. Really interesting painting. And shows very interesting Russian-style clothing. Almost seems more Turkish to me, which is interesting. Okay. So, I hope you enjoyed learning about those fascinating historical characters. I like learning about countries and traditions that are so different from our own. and it gives us such great background. Just think about what Russia is like currently. St. Petersburg is a beautiful, beautiful city, and the Winter Palace there is absolutely stunning. It's a privilege to be able to go there. So maybe you'll be able to visit that and the Kremlin, the Red Square, sometime yourself in your lifetime.